The 20th century is the era of the machine. The Paris World's Fair of 1889, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution, signaled the beginning of a new technological era. Modern technology attacked man's concept of himself as significant. Machines do not need a particular human being to operate them. Anyone will do. Human beings become faceless in the machine age.
A 31-mile cross-channel flight from Calais to Dover made history. It was a mere 5.5 years after the Wright brothers' first flight. After 37 minutes, the landing, and for the Frenchman Blériot, immortality.
At the dawn of the early 20th century, technological breakthroughs were almost sacred events. After French aviator Louis Blériot flew across the English Channel in 1909, Parisians carried his small plane through the streets and installed it in a deconsecrated church. Events like the 1889 Paris World Fair, Blériot's flight across the Channel, and Lindbergh's transatlantic flight made people feel that technology was the wave of the future, that it might even replace religion and give life some deep new meaning.
But what was the role of man's soul in the new religion of technology? The art movement known as Cubism offered the first real artistic attempt to find man's place in a world dominated by machines and modern science.
Cubism tried to reduce everything it portrayed to its essential structure. It attempted to turn reality into a series of geometric shapes, or cubes. The Cubists reduced art to a series of almost technical or mechanical images or patterns. Reality, as seen in nature, was irrelevant to the Cubists. The foremost Cubist was Pablo Picasso. For Picasso, the traditional concept of humanity and nature was something that could be changed through art. Art was a method of challenging the perception of reality held by the older artists, such as Rembrandt, among others. Picasso's 1907 masterpiece, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, is the symbol for all modern art. In this painting, Picasso reduces 5 huge female nudes to nothing more than architecture. In addition to the soulless portrayal of his subjects, Picasso was well known for his troubled relationships with women. Picasso once said of one of his lovers,
"It must be painful for a girl to see in a painting that she is on the way out."
Picasso's subtle hostility toward women is evidenced in many of his works. Picasso's 1937 portrait of Dora Maar, one of his lovers, entitled The Weeping Woman, portrays utter panic and despair. Warplanes hover where the irises of Maar's eyes should be, eyes that also read as suspended teacups spitting tears.
Picasso was followed by the French artist Marcel Duchamp. Like Picasso, Duchamp seemed to question humanity's free will and even suggested that all human movements are programmed and circumscribed. Man was an absurd machine in an absurd world. Here at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, we can see a clear progression in Duchamp's work from a humane view of people to an inhumane view, even a mechanical vision. For example, in his 1910 painting, The Chess Game, we see that Duchamp treats his subjects with great humanity and compassion. 1 year later, in 1911, in his portrait Dulcinea, we see that Duchamp treats his human subjects in a more mechanical way. By 1912, in his landmark painting, Nude Descending a Staircase number 2, the human form is gone. And by 1916, Duchamp has abandoned painting altogether and is now using ordinary objects, such as this bicycle wheel, to create an absurd anti-art. I'm standing here at the New York National Guard's 69th Regiment Armory. This was the site of the 1913 Armory Show. The Armory Show was an exhibition of some 2,000 pieces of modern art. The most significant were European. The Armory Show exploded onto an artistically naive America, which for the first time saw works of art by Van Gogh, Courbet, Gauguin, Monet, Cézanne, Picasso, Matisse, and Duchamp.
As a result of the Armory Show, museums of modern art would spring up all across America and would become an American institution. Modern art museums soon began to compete with churches as the center of civic pride in American communities.
In addition to the philosophical changes that were taking place in modern art at the beginning of the 20th century, other forces were at work. The First World War was to the physical and psychological destruction of Western culture what modern art was to the West spiritual culture. The horrors of modern warfare are graphically symbolized here at Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C.
Mechanized warfare brought horror to millions of ordinary men and women. 10 million soldiers and millions of civilians died. Thousands of others were maimed and blinded. The lost fathers, brothers, and husbands left a spiritual vacuum and the destruction of ideals, confidence, and goodwill. Ernest Hemmingway wrote that World War I saw the most colossal, murderous, mismanaged butchery that has ever taken place on Earth. Perhaps one of the least understood effects of World War I was its creation of a so-called generation gap.
The horrors of the war were impossible to communicate to the non-combatants. In addition, the crimes of the elders who had initiated the war seemed unforgivable to the young people who had fought in it.
a hatred of all authority and traditional beliefs, most visibly among a certain group of artists, writers, and entertainers, became fashionable. These artists wanted a new beginning, an escape from the madness of the war.
During the First World War, there was a fierce anti-establishment, anti-war movement emerging in Germany. This movement created an artistic form called Expressionism.
Expressionism turned inward to examine the passions of the soul, expressing emotional conflict in physical terms. The interest was not in the individual soul. Rather, the Expressionists were looking for some universal truth. The Expressionist painters tried to capture the meaning behind the oppressive appearance of reality.
One of the great works of Expressionism is Fate of the Animals by the German artist Franz Marc, who lived from 1880 to 1916. This painting is Marc's vision of the apocalypse overwhelming innocent life.
The original title of this painting, written on the back, is "All Being is Flaming Suffering." The fate of animals is that they are bound to cosmic laws, which are rigid and leave no room for freedom. Man is different from animals, as he knows that he has to die. But like the animal, he too is trapped in what seems to be an inescapable fate and destined to perish horribly.
Expressionist ideas are also applied to film. For example, in the classic 1919 film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, audiences experience psychological terror on the screen.
The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was one of the first films to use an unreal environment in a serious narrative centered on the inner psychological nature of the characters. This film has significance for Western culture, as it caught the alienation, frustration, tension, and horror of existence that have become the hallmark of much of modern Western society. Many Expressionist filmmakers eventually immigrated to the United States. One was filmmaker Fritz Lang, who made the influential 1926 film Metropolis. Lang's films were a reflection of the world being dominated by the machine and the rise of troubling political elements, later epitomized by Nazism.
Expressionism was inherently inconsistent. On the one hand, it was idealistic and celebrated the need for love and universal brotherhood in a bewildering world. On the other hand, it encouraged grotesque dramatization of bestiality, brutality, cruelty, and sensuality. These conflicting notions can be seen in contemporary cinema in the works of such accomplished directors as Tim Burton.
The similarities between sequences from The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or Metropolis with Burton's Batman, Batman Returns, Edward Scissorhands, and Ed Wood are clear. Burton has inserted the psychological nuances of expressionism in his films. For instance, in Batman Returns, Burton pays tribute to the classic German film Nosferatu, a startling and visually remarkable adaptation of the Dracula legend. A sense of dark pessimism seems to pervade the images of many of Burton's films in exactly the same way as that portrayed by the Expressionists.
Just as the painters affected the filmmakers, so too the scientists, especially the psychologists, affected the artists of their day. The rise of modern psychology began as a result of the pressing mental health needs of the fighting men of the First World War.
Prolonged trench fighting during the war had caused a stress-induced disturbance called shell shock. Even the well-connected sons of military families did not escape the trauma and drew attention to the plight of thousands of soldiers. The post-war fury at the cruelties of mental hospitals created the perfect opportunity for an alternative to the then current methods of drug therapy, religious counseling, bullying, or electric shock therapy. People were looking for new ways to treat traumatized soldiers.
This opportunity was seized by a Viennese psychologist named Sigmund Freud, who lived from 1856 to 1939.
Freud opened the first psychiatric polyclinic in 1920. In the same year, Freud's pupil and future biographer, Ernest Jones, launched the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. This journal popularized Freud's ideas to a very wide audience. Freud seemed to have an explanation for everything, and thus became the voice of the New Age. Freud attempted to replace the old ideas about sin and virtue. He replaced morality and choice with an idea of psychological conditioning. He adapted biology and the concept of acquired characteristics to psychology. He formulated his theories through self-analysis and confirmed them, he believed, through the psychoanalysis of others. The central problem that Freud dealt with was guilt.
Above all, Freud rejected the idea of guilt as a reaction to sin. Freud said that religious thought is actually dangerous to the future of humanity. He believed the response to guilt should be to find acceptable outlets for the dark side of human nature. To Freud, sin was only a management problem.
Freud became a household name in both the United States and Europe. He was popularized through literature and art, and especially through the new emerging art movement of surrealism.
The art movement of surrealism popularized Freud's ideas and built on them. Surrealism sought a way for man's dark side to prevail and to be openly expressed. Surrealism is an art style that was developed to deliberately convey the message that there's no fixed or certain reality.
The surrealists portrayed a world in which dreams and the subconscious are all that one can be certain of. Unlike Impressionism, which tried to reduce reality to impressions of light and dark, and Cubism, which tried to find the essential geometric shape of things, Surrealism abandoned reality altogether and surrendered itself to a world of nightmare and the subconscious. Surrealist paintings generally reflect Freud's concept of the unconscious mind. Salvador Dali revered Freud like a devout Christian might revere the Gospels. Dali's painting, Persistence of Memory, is a good example of the surrender to unreality. In this painting of melting watches and a landscape peeled back to reveal bare earth beneath, we can see that the line between reality and the subconscious has been erased.
Painters were not the only Surrealist artists. Filmmakers also began using Surrealist art. Luis Buñuel, schoolmate and friend of Dali, expressed his Surrealist views through shocking images. Buñuel's first film, the classic 1928 Un Chien Andalou, is an excellent example of the Surrealist attempt to subvert and shock the conscious mind with horrific images drawn from the dark side of the subconscious mind.
The film Un Chien Andalou begins in a ghastly fashion with an apparently passive woman having her eyeball sliced with a razor. Buñuel believed that to produce a state permitting the free association of ideas, it would be necessary to produce a traumatic shock at the beginning of the film. Buñuel used images of ant-infested sores. Dismembered hands. Sexual assaults. Live human burials. And murder. Surrealist art was seen as a clear challenge to religion. In fact, Buñuel's film, L'Âge d'Or, made 2 years after Un Chien Andalou, was seen as so blatantly anti-Catholic that riots broke out in Paris when it was shown. Alfred Hitchcock incorporated surrealism into many of his films, such as the 1960 Psycho, 1958 Vertigo, and The Birds in 1963.
They're coming! They're coming!
Images by surrealist painter Giorgio de Chirico find their way into Hitchcock's film Vertigo. Surrealism continues to have an influence on modern film. Director David Lynch's first feature film, the 1977 Eraserhead, is a nightmare that explores the relationship of a man and a monster. After the acclaimed and dreamlike film The Elephant Man, made in 1980, Lynch made Blue Velvet in 1986, which appears to draw heavily from similar images in Un Chien Andalou.
Faith in technology, expressionism, and surrealism, the lingering effects of the First World War, as well as the questions these raised about traditional religion, coalesced into the pessimism that is the hallmark of the 20th century. This pessimism was captured by the American author and poet T.S. Eliot, who died in 1965.
Eliot believed that the road of modern culture led nowhere. He forcefully expressed this idea in his 1922 epic poem, The Wasteland.
He who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying with a little patience. Here is no water but only rock. Rock and no water and the sandy road, the road winding above among the mountains, which are mountains of rock without water. If there were water, we should stop and drink. Amongst the rock one cannot stop or think. Sweat is dry and feet are in the sand. If there were only water amongst the rock, dead mountain mouse of carious teeth that cannot...
In this classic poem, Eliot seems to be saying that modern thought has resulted in the intellectual and emotional suicide of Western culture. Eliot's own search for meaning ended when he became a Christian and joined the Anglican Church in 1926. He saw himself as transcending the wasteland of modern existence and awaiting the awakening of the rest of humanity. He wrote, "The world is trying the experiment of attempting to form a civilized but non-Christian mentality. The experiment will fail. But we must be very patient in awaiting its collapse, meanwhile redeeming the time, so that the faith may be preserved alive through the dark ages before us, to renew and rebuild civilization and save the world from suicide."
In Eliot, we come full circle. In his work, we have one of the few 20th century artists who rejected the cynicism of the modern age and instead embraced the tradition of Christian hope. However, of the great artists of the 20th century, Eliot was practically alone. Most of the artists and intellectuals continue to explore any alternative worldview except traditional religion.